Steph Curry, one of the most famous basketball players in the world, has everything: fame, fortune, and success. But what happens when he spends an entire week living as a beggar? The struggles he faces, the people he meets, and the lessons he learns will not only change his life, but also shock you. Steph Curry, known for his incredible skills on the basketball court, was admired by millions. Yet, there was an emptiness in his heart that he couldn't shake. One evening, while driving through the city, he noticed a homeless man sitting by the side of the road. The man held a sign that read, "I'm invisible to the world." The simple yet heartbreaking message pierced Steph's soul. He couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, as Steph lay in his luxurious bed, he couldn't sleep. The words of the homeless man echoed in his mind. He began to question the true meaning of success and whether his achievements had any value if so many people in the world went unnoticed and unloved. The thought grew stronger until he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would step away from his world of comfort and experience life as a homeless person for 1 week. The next morning, Steph put on tattered clothes, leaving his wallet, phone, and identity behind. He walked out of his mansion into a world he had only seen from his car window. His first steps into this new life were filled with nervousness and fear. Would people recognize him? How would he survive? As the day turned to night, Steph found a quiet spot under a bridge. He lay on a piece of cardboard, the cold wind biting through his thin jacket. The sounds of the city felt louder than ever, and the passing cars seemed to mock his loneliness. For the first time in his life, he felt invisible, truly invisible. No fans cheering his name, no cameras flashing. Just silence and the harsh reality of being ignored by the world. Steph's mind raced with questions. How do people live like this? How do they find hope when every moment feels so heavy? As he tried to sleep, his thoughts were interrupted by hunger pangs. He realized he hadn't eaten all day. The gnawing hunger and freezing cold made him feel more human, more vulnerable than he ever had before. The image of the homeless man's sign came back to him. "I'm invisible to the world." Steph now understood the pain behind those words. This was only his first night, and already he felt a weight in his chest. He couldn't imagine enduring this life for years like so many others had to. As he drifted off to a restless sleep, Steph made a silent promise. He wouldn't just observe this life, he would truly live it, feel it, and understand it. Only then could he make a real difference. And so, his journey began, one that would teach him lessons he never expected to learn. Steph Curry, who once dazzled the world with his basketball skills, now found himself sitting under a cold, dark bridge. The once celebrated star had traded his luxury and comfort for a thin, worn-out blanket and a hard piece of cardboard as his bed. The chilling wind cut through him like ice, making his body tremble. He pulled the blanket tighter, but it was no match for the freezing night air. As cars rushed by on the nearby road, their headlights briefly lit the dark corner where Steph sat. The sound of engines roared, a sharp contrast to the deafening silence around him. The world didn't stop for him, it barely noticed him. For the first time in his life, Steph felt what it meant to be invisible. Steph's thoughts began to spiral. How do people survive this every day? How do they find hope? He tried to keep his mind positive, but the fear and discomfort were overwhelming. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. His last meal had been hours ago, but it felt like days. The cold concrete beneath him made every part of his body ache. He stared up at the dark sky. There were no stars tonight, just clouds and a biting wind. He thought about the homeless man whose sign had inspired him to take this journey. "I'm invisible to the world." Now, Steph truly understood those words. The loneliness was heavier than he could have imagined. Despite his discomfort, Steph knew he couldn't give up. He had promised himself he would live this life fully, even if it was only for a week. But this was only his first night, and it already felt unbearable. If I'm struggling this much, how do people survive this for years? The thought broke his heart. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Steph wrapped his arms around his knees, shivering and waiting for the morning light. He realized this wasn't just a test of his physical endurance, it was a test of his spirit. Steph Curry sat quietly on the cold pavement, his stomach growling and his body shivering from the biting wind. It was his second day living on the streets, and the reality of this life was beginning to sink in. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, and every sound of footsteps passing by felt like a reminder of how alone he was. No one looked his way. No one stopped to help. The feeling of invisibility weighed heavy on his heart. As Steph tried to distract himself from the pain in his stomach, a man with torn gloves and a weathered face approached him. The man, who looked like he had been on the streets for years, sat down beside Steph without saying a word. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of the man's plastic bag. Then, the man reached into his bag and pulled out a sandwich, old and slightly crumpled, but still edible. He broke it in half and handed one piece to Steph. Steph hesitated, staring at the small portion of food. "It's okay," the man said, his voice calm but kind. "We might not have much, but sharing keeps us alive." Steph's throat tightened as he took the sandwich. The man's simple gesture of kindness struck him deeply. This man had so little, yet he chose to give half of what he had to someone he didn't even know. Steph tried to thank him, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was nod and take a bite. The sandwich was dry and stale, but at that moment, it felt like the most meaningful meal Steph had ever eaten. He looked at the man, who simply smiled and said, "Out here, we've got to look out for each other. That's the only way to survive." As they sat together, Steph realized the profound strength in the man's act of kindness. It wasn't about the sandwich, it was about the connection, the shared humanity in a world that often felt so cold and isolating. For the first time since starting his journey, Steph felt a spark of warmth. This moment stayed with Steph, not because it solved his hunger, but because it reminded him of the power of compassion. If someone with so little could still find it in their heart to give, then perhaps there was hope for the world after all. If stories like this inspire you, don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can share these powerful moments of humanity and bring attention to those who need it most. Steph Curry walked slowly down the busy street, his tattered clothes and tired face blending into the shadows of the city. His stomach churned with hunger, and his feet ached from endless walking. This life on the streets was harder than he could have ever imagined. Yet, amidst the cold and chaos, it was the people he met who left the deepest impression on him. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small boy sitting on the sidewalk with a stack of crumpled papers in front of him. The boy, no older than 10, was drawing with the stub of a pencil. His hands were red from the cold, but his smile was warm and full of life. Steph approached him, curious about what he was doing. "Hey, what are you drawing?" Steph asked softly. The boy looked up, his eyes lighting up. "I'm making pictures to sell," he said proudly, holding up a drawing of a bright sun and a tree. The lines were shaky, but the image radiated hope. "I want to buy some food for my mom. She's sick, but she says we need to stay strong. She always says, our hearts should stay strong, no matter how weak our bodies feel." Steph felt his chest tighten. This boy, so young and full of hope, was carrying a burden far heavier than he deserved. Despite his hardships, He smiled as if the world hadn't crushed his spirit. Steph bought one of the boys' drawings, though he knew the money wouldn't go far. Still, it was all he could offer at that moment. Later that evening, Steph found himself sitting next to an elderly woman on a bench. She was hunched over, clutching something close to her chest. Her frail hands trembled as she adjusted her coat. Curious, Steph asked, "What are you holding?" The woman turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and strength. She slowly opened her hands to reveal a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a family, 2 young children, and a man standing beside her younger self. "This is my family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're all gone now. My husband passed away first, then my children. One by one. This picture is all I have left. It's my anchor. When the days feel too heavy, I look at it, and it reminds me that I was once loved." Tears welled up in Steph's eyes as he listened. He couldn't imagine the pain of losing everything, yet this woman held on to a piece of hope, even if it was just a photograph. Her resilience and quiet strength moved him deeply. That night, as Steph lay on the cold ground, the faces of the boy and the woman stayed with him. Their stories were different, yet their message was the same. Even in the darkest times, hope could still exist. It wasn't about the weight of their struggles, but the strength of their hearts. If these stories inspire you, consider subscribing to support more content that brings attention to unseen lives. Together, we can share these powerful tales and remind the world of the resilience and kindness that exist even in hardship. Steph Curry had always thought of resilience as something tied to winning games or overcoming challenges on the court. But as the days passed on the streets, he realized resilience meant so much more. It wasn't about glory or applause. It was about surviving each day with hope, even when the odds were stacked against you. He saw resilience in the eyes of the people around him, those who had lost everything yet refused to let life break them. There was Mike, an older man who had been living on the streets for years. Despite his hardships, Mike always had a smile for those around him. "Out here," he told Steph one night, "we don't have much, but we have each other. And that's enough to keep going." Steph also met a woman named Clara, who would collect scraps of fabric and sew small patches to fix her tattered coat. She proudly told him, "I may not have much, but I can still take care of what I have. That's something." It was these moments, small acts of kindness and strength, that began to change Steph's perception. He saw a boy share his only piece of bread with a stray dog, and an elderly man use his last bit of change to buy coffee for a friend who was feeling down. They didn't have much, but they gave with their hearts. Steph realized that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through the simplest actions. It wasn't about having everything. It was about appreciating what you had and sharing it with others. For the first time, Steph understood the true meaning of resilience, not just surviving but finding hope and kindness, even in the hardest circumstances. Steph Curry stepped back into his grand home, but the warmth of the place felt different now. The soft rugs under his feet, the scent of fresh flowers, and the stocked kitchen seemed almost foreign after a week spent on the streets. He had returned to the life of comfort he was used to, yet something had fundamentally shifted within him. As he sat in his quiet study that evening, the faces of the people he met during his journey filled his mind. Mike, the kind-hearted man who shared his sandwich. Clara, who found hope in sewing patches on her coat. The young boy selling drawings to feed his sick mother. The elderly woman clutching a faded photograph of her lost family. These were not just strangers to Steph anymore. They were teachers who had shown him the true meaning of resilience, kindness, and hope. Steph decided he couldn't let their lessons fade away. He began writing letters, pouring his gratitude onto paper. To Mike, He wrote about how his act of sharing had inspired Steph to see the power of giving, even when one has little to spare. To Clara, he expressed admiration for her strength and her ability to find dignity in small acts. To the boy, he wrote about how his drawings reminded Steph of the beauty of hope in the hardest times. And to the elderly woman, he thanked her for showing him the value of cherishing memories and love. But Steph knew that words alone were not enough. He realized he had the power to make a real difference. Using his platform and resources, he launched an initiative to support the homeless community. The program focused on providing shelter, food, and healthcare, as well as education and job opportunities to help people rebuild their lives. Steph made sure that his initiative wasn't just a generic charity, it was personal. He named shelters after the people who had touched his heart during his week on the streets. A center for single mothers was named after Clara, honoring her resilience. A community art program for children was inspired by the boy selling drawings. Each effort was a tribute to the lives that had transformed his own. Months later, Steph returned to the places where he had spent his week. This time, he wasn't a visitor in disguise. He was there to reconnect and to share the fruits of his newfound purpose. He found Mike, now a mentor at one of the shelters, helping others find their footing. Clara had moved into a warm home, her smile brighter than ever. The boy and his mother were now part of a supportive community, and the elderly woman had found solace in a group that celebrated shared memories. As Steph stood among the people who had taught him so much, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. His journey had been about more than understanding homelessness. It had been about rediscovering humanity. In his final reflection, Steph said, "They taught me the meaning of hope, resilience, and love, and for that, I am forever grateful." If this story inspired you, remember to spread kindness and take action. Together, we can create a better world. Months had passed since Steph Curry returned from his week on the streets, but the memories of that time lingered deeply in his heart. One evening, he felt an irresistible pull to revisit the bridge where his journey began, the cold, desolate place where he spent his first night as a homeless man. As he approached the bridge, he carried a small notebook in his hand. This bridge was no longer just a spot in the city, it was a symbol of transformation, of lessons learned, and of a journey that changed his perspective forever. Steph knelt down and opened the notebook, tearing out a single page where he had carefully written the words, "The greatest wealth is found in the hearts of those who share love, not money." With quiet determination, Steph pinned the note to the wall beneath the bridge. He stepped back and let the message sink in, not just for himself, but for anyone who might pass by. This wasn't just a statement, it was a promise to live a life guided by compassion, understanding, and love. Standing there, Steph reflected on all he had learned. The resilience of the people he met, their kindness despite their struggles, and the power of hope had reshaped his idea of success. True wealth, he realized, wasn't in possessions or achievements, but in the love and kindness we give to others. As he walked away, Steph thought of all the people who still needed help, their voices often unheard. He knew his journey was just beginning. If this story has touched your heart, remember to share kindness wherever you go. And if you believe in spreading these messages of hope, don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can create a world where no one feels invisible.